Surprisingly, there's one GPU that I think everybody's buying when they go to buy a GPU. Let me give you a little anecdotal evidence. When I was at my local micro center, there were various people getting PC builds done and getting parts, and there was one GPU in particular that everybody seemed to be buying. This is gonna at first be a little surprising because people are buying GPUs. Some people think that the market is completely dead. I even thought it was pretty much stagnant, but happens to be that one particular GPU is selling better than others. And then there's something else that Nvidia is doing. If you guys remember, they restricted this GPU as to some rumors in terms of its manufacturing, meaning we would see less. And that's exactly what I've been seeing. When I take a look at my local micro center, for example, as well as various other online stores, the 599 version of the RTX 4070, and that's the GPU that I'm talking about, seems to really be a lot harder to find. You can still see when we take a look here, there's no 599 version. There's plenty of the 679 and the ones that are a little bit more expensive. Even those, there are less of them now than there were during the initial launch. So if Nvidia was stopping, making these GPUs for a little while, it certainly seems to have caught up in terms of the retail area. Now, does it make any sense that people are buying the 4070? In a weird way, I think that it does, because remember, when it came out, the reviews weren't terrible. People were like, it's an okay GPU. It's too expensive for what it is. It should be like a 4060 class GPU, but they weren't really that bad. I think what pushed it over the edge was the release of the 4060 Ti. That GPU, rightfully so, was pretty much destroyed in the news media, in all of the reviews, people saying how terrible that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is in 2023. That GPU made the 4070 actually appear to be a better deal, if you will. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. Now, 4070 has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which while it's still lower than we'd like to see, 16 gigabytes is definitely going to be that sweet spot where you have a little bit more room in a lot of these games, even at 1440p, a resolution that the 4070 is targeting, by the way. Seems that 12 gigabytes of VRAM sometimes can be an issue, but it's better than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Obviously, the memory bus is still 192-bit like the 4070 Ti, so it's certainly not ideal, but compared to the 4060 Ti, it's certainly much better. So that's why I think a lot of people are actually buying the 4070. When I was testing the 4070, my first reaction to it was, this GPU is actually not that bad. I mean, the first game that I tried to test was Cyberpunk in overdrive at 1440p. Obviously, I put on DLSS, as you have to, even on a 4090 with overdrive, and I was surprised how playable the game actually was. Sure, 12 gigabytes of VRAM would have been nicer if it was stretched out a little bit, but in general, the game actually played pretty decently at 1440p. And then even look, I took a look and I benchmarked. These are my own numbers of my own system that I tested the 4070 versus other GPUs. You can see that typically it's going to be way ahead of the RTX 4060 Ti. Buying an RTX 40 series, DLSS, if supported, is certainly something that you do want to use in these games that support it. So in Cyberpunk, you could see on the benchmark in overdrive, a 4060 Ti is with DLSS is getting around, around 55 FPS, which isn't really terrible considering overdrive, but if you keep playing it for a while, that VRAM buffer will fill up eventually at 1440p, and you're going to get a much less smooth experience, while the 4070 is a lot more comfortable, 74 FPS with these settings. So that's a pretty significant difference. I mean, you would have to step up to something much, much faster. So if we take a look at a different game here, we could see a game like Jedi Survivor, which doesn't have DLSS. It has FSR too, but if we take away FSR, 4060 Ti 47 FPS versus the 4070 59 FPS. That's a difference between being a little bit more stuttery and considerably more playable. And remember, if you play for a long time, that VRAM, as it starts to fill up, is going to be a lot better on that 4070. Even another game that's straight rasterization here without any DLSS, Horizon Zero Dawn, we can see that the 4060 Ti is around 108 FPS. The 4070, you get up to 144 FPS. That's going to get a lot closer to maybe utilizing or maxing out a lot of 1440p monitors, which happen to be 144 FPS in a lot of cases. Even if it's 240 hertz, you can still get a lot closer to that number with something like the 4070. And then I even saw a bigger difference in some games like Resident Evil 4 Remake, I think because of the VRAM. If we see here the 4060 Ti getting roughly something like 65 FPS, while the 4070 with the same settings can often get around 97 or closer to 100. That's a much more substantial difference, and I think that's because of the VRAM limitation. Now, you would have to turn down the settings on the 4060 Ti, and then you can get a more comparable performance with the 4070, but in the same type of settings, the VRAM is going to be much better on the 4070, having 12 gigabytes. That way you're going to be able to stretch those legs, I think, considerably further. And even in a game like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we can see 78 FPS versus 97 FPS on the benchmark. So as we can see, there's a pretty sizable gap between a 4060 Ti and a 4070. It's not as close as it used to be with the 3060 Ti and 3070. We're seeing much bigger performance differences, especially at 1440p, a resolution that the 4060 Ti really isn't built to really handle that well with modern games. It's more of like a 1080p GPU, really. That's the way that Nvidia sells it, and with only 8 gigabytes of VRAM, that's really what it's looking like. At that resolution of 1440p, the 4070's 12 gigabytes of VRAM is just much better in a lot of these modern titles that really take advantage of having more VRAM. That's why I think a lot of people are actually buying the 4070, and if we look at the current product stack, above it we have a 4070 Ti, which is often much more expensive, at least 200 or more in terms of the price, and that's in the US. Overseas, the pricing can be a lot more drastic. You can have a lot bigger differences. That's why the 4070 is kind of in a place of its own here. While it's too expensive for what it is, people don't really have much other, better choices on the market unless they want to go to like AMD, for example. 6950 XT, aside from ray tracing, will definitely beat this GPU pretty handedly. And we even pointed out recently that they've had some really good sales on that GPU. You can get one for as cheap as $599, the exact same price as the 4070. If you buy a CPU, for example, at Micro Center or even online, you can find it pretty readily for like $600 to $650. So this isn't even exclusive just to the US. I even saw other, overseas buyers. They've seen the 6950X for pretty close pricing to the 4070 or even cheaper, like in the 600, euro range, or often like around there. So it's definitely something that can be found. And with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, something you could definitely consider. Even though it's a last generation GPU, it still performs better in many cases than the 4070. But I can see why people want Nvidia. Maybe they want DLSS 3, and the 4070 is much more, power efficient than the 6950 XT. But certainly the 4070 is much better than the 4060 Ti. There's no doubt about that. And I think that even in the down market that we're in for hardware sales and GPUs, the reason that it's selling is that it's at least a reasonable option compared to everything else that we have. Even though it's not ideal, it's nowhere near as bad as the 4060 Ti. That GPU you should just not buy. You're going to have way too many limitations, even at 1080p. The 4070, if you're left with that, as we see in a lot of these numbers, it actually performs decently enough. And the only issue really, it's nicer if it was $499. I think at that price, it would be a pretty very good GPU, something easy to recommend. At $599, it's still a little sketchy. It's still a little expensive, but listen, there's not that much out there aside from the AMD GPUs that we pointed to. And if you want a new one that's Nvidia, that's really going to be your best option. So fortunately, that's kind of like what we're left with, kind of like that lukewarm area. But at the end of the day, 1440p, it's not a terrible GPU. So we have to see what happens in the future. Hopefully, the 4060 Ti really gets a discount, because at $399, really bad GPU for 8 gigabytes of VRAM only. only. And I have one right behind me here actually that I've been playing games with and testing. And really, you can see by the numbers and by the performance, the 4070 is just going to be the better overall option. All right, guys, let me know what you think. Have you seen the 4070 sell more than you thought they should be selling? Let me know what you think down below. Remember to subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next video.